current CBC employees are reaching out to you since Travis came forward. In general, what are they telling you?
I've heard about the crying room.
The crying room.
Yep.
What's the crying room? Okay, what was your reaction when you heard that? Because I'm hearing this for the first time and my mind is exploding.
I haven't shared it with anyone publicly yet.
Travis Dhanraj was one of the most recognizable faces on CBC News, but earlier this month he walked away, or in his words, was forced out after describing a toxic retaliatory culture behind the scenes. Today we're speaking with his lawyer, Kathryn Marshall, who has been vocal about what she sees as a systemic problem inside of CBC, one that shapes who gets to speak, who gets sidelined, and what Canadians are allowed to hear. Let's take a look. Kathryn, welcome to Northern Perspective. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just get right into this. Has Travis officially resigned from CBC? CBC would have us believe that he hasn't and that he's still on leave. And there seems to be a disagreement, as it were. So what is the story?
So Travis has resigned. Of course, it's not voluntary. He didn't want to do it. He was really forced to resign. But really bizarrely, CBC has not accepted his resignation. They're actually continuing to pay him. And if you ask CBC, they'll say he's still employed there. It's completely strange. I don't understand why they're taking that position, but he has resigned.
So in my experience and talking with legal experts in my past, based on what Travis has described, I would interpret that as something I'm sure you know, but our viewers may not know, something called constructive dismissal, where the workplace makes it so difficult for you to actually perform your job that you have no choice but to leave. And that sounds like what Travis did. But considering they're continuing to pay him, what does the law say about situations like this?
Well, the law doesn't really say much about that situation because it's so unusual. Like, I've probably dealt with thousands of cases over the years against massive corporations, and I've never had a company actually reject my client's resignation and then continue to pay them. Of course, only a company that gets lots of taxpayer money is going to do that, I guess. And I kind of want to wonder, who else do they still have on payroll who quit a long time ago? But you're right about constructive dismissal. That is what Travis's case is. He was not fired. He was forced to quit, essentially, because the CBC was forcing him to be silent. They were trying to intimidate him. They wouldn't let him really be a journalist and do the things that he needed to do as a journalist. And they wanted him to not live by his integrity and his values and his morals. And there's a lot in this case that will come out later. So I'm going to share with you what I'm able to share now. But what I've seen so far, just in the documents and the evidence, it is really shocking. I think a lot of what people assumed the CBC was like as a company to work for is true, and it actually is worse than what you imagined.
Well, and as it relates to, what he's alleging and what CBC's response was, if nobody saw or heard anything else, they could just chalk this up to, maybe a disgruntled employee, and it comes down to a he said, she said scenario. But not too long ago, there was some audio that leaked out into the media, and we actually covered it on Northern Perspective as well, that actually was part of a disciplinary meeting that the CBC had with Travis around a tweet that he actually put up about not getting an interview with then president of the CBC, Kathryn Tate. What was your reaction when you heard that? Because this has raised eyebrows all across the country and put a lot of legitimacy behind Travis's claims.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, that meeting, when you listen to the audio, and I can confirm it is legitimate audio, it's a real recording.
Do you understand the concern with this post as it relates to the principle of integrity?
No, I really don't. I don't, and again, Andre, like I find it problematic that we are in a meeting where we are discussing something that is in the interests of the corporation. So I'm not seeing the separation right now between the journalism and the interest of the corporation. I see how it would be in the interest of the corporation for this tweet not to be out, but I don't see how journalistically it's not sound. That's the kind of like disconnect that I'm having right now.
But when you listen to it, what you're really hearing is an employee being intimidated. In that meeting, you have HR, you have Travis's boss, and you have someone from the union, and they're cornering him. And Travis is pretty much being attacked for posting a tweet that simply pointed out that the president of the CBC did not respond to a request for comment. And, he's being grilled and asked, have you thought about how this makes CBC look? What about integrity? Like he's being grilled. And what's very obvious in that recording and that meeting is that the CBC is a lot more preoccupied with how they look as a company and their image and protecting the people at the top than they are with journalism and stories and fact finding and truth finding, which of course is the core of what a journalist's job is.
Well, and we even saw that displayed by Kathryn Tate herself when she was called to committee to testify on the potential payment of bonuses to herself and to executives. And in a year that CBC saw massive decline in its viewership, and she was asked to justify that. And to say that she was trying to skate around those answers is putting it mild, to say the least. So when you have the president essentially practicing that type of behavior, that all typically rolls downhill in an organization, unfortunately. But I think the most commendable thing about that recording was hearing Travis stick to his guns, stand his ground, and say, I'm very comfortable with my integrity. I'm following the journalistic standards that we're supposed to be practicing at the CBC, which, as a boss, you've told me to to
Yeah.
practice in the first place. So the irony is next level when he's being called out on integrity when he is actually the one showing the integrity in that meeting, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually the definition of gaslighting. I see gaslighting a lot in situations where there's an employee who is just not towing the line and standing up for themselves. And you could see in that meeting, like the CBC executives were really trying to just distort Travis's version of reality. Of course, he stood up for himself and he handled it very well. But for a lot of employees, that would break them being in meetings like that. And you have to wonder how many journalists have they pulled into meetings like that. That clearly was part of their process. You could tell this wasn't a one-off thing, that this is something that CBC does to manage employees. And how really can a broadcaster be holding the government to account and reporting on stories and doing their job when you know that they won't even let the journalists question the CBC management?
Well, and this all comes back to this question that Canadians across the country are asking, which is how can an organization, a quote unquote news organization whose budget is 70% funded by taxpayer dollars, how can they objectively hold the government to account, the government who is paying 70% of their budget? It is, anyone with common sense will say that, well, you can't bite the hand that feeds you. And this has been the impression that CBC has been giving Canadians for decades at this point, and it's why they've lost trust. CBC used to be a trusted network, a network that I think Canadians were proud of, that delivered quality programming, that informed us unapologetically about our history and allowed us to celebrate our country and be proud of Canada. And now the perception of CBC around the country is one that they're just a liberal government, mouthpiece.
Yeah, like even like I grew up watching CBC. A lot of people I know did. I mean, we always would watch The National as a family. And you're right about the erosion of trust. And when you're seeing, or you're listening to a recording like the one you referenced, and you hear about Travis's situation, that those are the kinds of things that really cause people to lose their faith in the CBC. I've had so many emails and phone calls from other employees at CBC, from former employees, people who have similar stories to Travis. So I can tell you this is not an isolated thing. It's systemic. Travis is not the only one who's experienced it. And I'm sure CBC is going to try and argue that Travis is a disgruntled employee, or he just is difficult. That's usually difficult is the line, the label that is given to employees who won't just give up, right? And who won't just do what they say. But Travis is a really great guy. He's smart. He is someone who cares about doing his job. And the people who've been messaging me are, I've got journalists who had lots of integrity, and the stories they've been telling me are wild. So there'll be a time and a place for all of these things to come out. They will be shared. But we're still waiting for CBC to pick up the phone and call us. But they won't even acknowledge that he's quit. That's how far gone they are in their own worldview. They can't accept facts.
Well, and speaking of worldview, that's a great dovetail, because Travis has said himself that CBC seemed to assume that he would hold a liberal worldview, and this isn't really paraphrasing. He said this pretty close, because of the color of his skin, and that he was punished when he platformed some conservative voices. So, do you believe that CBC is trying to enforce ideological conformity on racialized journalists or journalists of a different color? Like, was he sidelined because he wasn't committed to conforming to their narrative?
So my theory is that the CBC definitely thought, looking at Travis, that he would espouse a certain worldview, that he would maybe espouse a liberal worldview. And they were surprised when he didn't. And it's interesting because it's not that Travis is conservative. He's not a partisan political person. He just wanted to bring on a diversity of voices on his show. And because he wasn't out there actively attacking conservatives all the time, like other people at CBC are, conservative voices were happy to come on his show because they knew they were going to get a fair shake, and they knew that they weren't going to be sandbagged and set up. And I think there was some jealousy within CBC because the other correspondents couldn't get conservatives onto their show because they didn't treat them fairly. But that's kind of how it started. And I think there was a lot of frustration that Travis wasn't fitting the mold that CBC had for him, and that he was also getting these scoops and he was getting these guests who other correspondents couldn't get. But rather than, actually, learn from Travis and say, okay, well, actually, here's a journalist who's, doing his job, they decided to punish him.
Well, and that's I think, the most ludicrous aspect about this whole thing. To your point, it's not that Travis was a far right leaning conservative or anything like that. He was literally doing what most Canadians expect a journalist to do, which is, if you're going to come at the conservatives in a hard way, then you come at the liberals in a hard way. You come at the NDP in a hard way. Or if you're going to give the liberals latitude, then you give the conservatives the same latitude. You need to be consistent based on every guest that you have from any political stripe that happens to come on your show. So the fact that he's being punished for literally being what an ideal journalist should be, that's the biggest indictment of the quality of news that CBC wants to put out in the first place, based on what I see.
Yeah, and also like they're making an example of as to how they want their journalists to be. So they're basically saying, don't be like Travis.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be like him, forget about having a career. I mean, they ripped Travis off the air. They tried to get him to sign an NDA. I don't even want to call it an NDA. It was more like a gag order. I've never seen anything like it. It was crazy. Hauling him into HR meetings. I mean, other people who work in the CBC are seeing this, right? And they're thinking, I don't want to be next. And you can't even blame them, because when you're being gaslit and you're being bullied and you're being intimidated, it has a huge impact on your mental health and your well-being and your confidence, and it's scary. And of course the CBC makes it seem like they can ruin your career, that you'll be blacklisted. So you've really got to wonder, like, which other journalists at the CBC maybe try to also be fair and bring conservative voices on their shows, and not sandbag all right-leaning guests, and were punished for it.
Now you've mentioned publicly, you've mentioned it earlier today, that former CBC employees, or maybe even current CBC employees, are reaching out to you since Travis came forward. I know you probably can't provide specifics because they talk to you in confidence, but in general, what are they telling you, and how does this demonstrate that there's a larger pattern and a systemic issue at CBC?
I've heard about the crying room.
The crying room.
Yep.
What's the crying room?
The crying room is a place where CBC employees are told to go if they're upset at work about something that happened to them, and they're supposed to shut the door and cry alone there. Yeah.
So
This is a real thing, and it's a real place, and you have so many employees crying and upset and in distress that there's a room for them.
So rather than go talk to your union rep, go talk to your union executive, go talk to HR and deal with an issue, go talk to your manager, deal with the issue, we have a room that we just want you to go and cry and get out your emotions. We don't want to deal with them. We don't want to deal with the problem. Just get back to work.
Yep. And don't cry in front of other people. Cry behind a door. This is all really happening, and it's so, I mean, toxic's not even the word I can put towards it. It's beyond that. But there is a CBC studio in this country, and now this will come out later, but they have a crying room, and it gets used a lot. And that's a term not coined by the employees. That's a term coined by management. They call it the crying room.
Okay, so that puts a different spin on this, just because, and I'm glad you said that, because normally that would be a term that the employees would just make up, but
no,
this is now being viewed as more an official term.
And in fact, the employees wanted to change the name because they were so traumatized by the idea that in their own workplace there was a room called the crying room. They didn't want to call it that. That was management's choice.
Okay, what was your reaction when you heard that? Because I'm hearing this for the first time
I
and
know.
my mind is exploding.
I haven't shared it with anyone publicly yet. So you're the first person. Um, I I was shocked. It took me a while to absorb it. I was shocked. And that for me, it wasn't just the fact that this room exists, but that it was being labeled as the crying room by management. It shows me that they don't think there's anything wrong with that. That it's almost like a joke to them, like people crying at work. Oh, go to the crying room. The other thing that really disturbed me is I don't, you might be aware of this just because you're in media, and there is a documentary called The Dying Room. It's it's a very impactful documentary um about a room where children are being left to die. And don't watch it unless you're ready to sob. So the fact when I heard the crying room, I'm like, whoever coined this term is like using a play on words on the dying room. Like this is not funny, like this is not a joke, but it's clearly a joke to them. It made me very angry.
And it seems to symbolize ironically, in a nutshell, in one room, based on what we're hearing from Travis, based on what you're hearing from other employees, it seems to symbolize the culture at CBC is that you will comply. We're not going to help you. We're not going to let you leave. The CBC is starting to feel like the Hotel California is basically what it's starting to feel like. Is that you're once you get in, you're trapped, and we don't care what type of trauma that you are experiencing. We don't care how people treat you. Go have a cry, and you're not allowed to quit. You're not allowed to check out. It literally sounds like the Hotel California.
Yeah, there's probably less crying at the Hotel California, but I mean, yes, exactly. And it shows that there's a complete disdain for the employees who are, they're speaking out, they're expressing emotions, and yeah, it's I didn't plan to share the crying room today, but like I just had to because people need to know that this is real and that it's systemic and that there's so many employees have suffered. And if your workplace has a room called the crying room, that is so messed up. That's institutional trauma. That is a representation of a very rotten, toxic work culture. And you need to get out.
Okay, so it's hard to pivot off of that.
Yeah.
But that just it opens up so many issues, and I think the next question that I have is more from a legal / human rights perspective, and it also makes me wonder because I've worked in organizations where there are unions. I've worked in organizations where there are government unions. What is the union doing? Like, is the union not standing up for its members? Is the union not trying to stand up for Travis right now? Because that's literally the union's job.
I mean, it's a great question. Look, all you have to know about the union is that they were in that meeting with Travis where he was being intimidated. They were watching. They were complicit. They were part of it. And the union has not done anything to help Travis. They, in fact, I think, enable CBC and help CBC do the things that they're doing to employees. So no, they've done nothing. They've not been there for Travis. But yeah, I mean, even in that meeting, like what were they doing there? They're just sitting there while Travis was getting raked over the coals for one tweet that was totally innocuous. They were just sitting there.
Based on what you've heard, and I know this will need to either be a careful answer or a non-answer, so I understand. Based on what you've heard from Travis, based on the evidence you've seen, based on what you've heard from employees that are at the CBC, is there suggestion of any criminal activity going on based on all of this that you've heard?
No, Lovely, it's not criminal. Not that it would make a huge difference because, in Canada, we don't really have much of a criminal justice system, but there are a lot of employment violations going on. It's important that people realize they have a right to a safe and healthy workplace. You have a right to go to work and not be abused or yelled at or gaslit or pulled into crazy HR meetings and intimidated or told to go to the crying room. Those are not normal things that you have to put up with. And employers, especially publicly funded ones, have a really high onus of care and duty to their employees. So I think there's a lot of labor law violations happening. I think the union is failing in their duty to represent their unionized members who are paying their dues. And then I think CBC management is engaging in constructive dismissal, human rights violations, discrimination. Certainly in Travis's case, but in a lot of other cases I've also seen. I just want to be really clear, like, this is systemic. It's not just one employee. It's a lot of people who've been impacted. And it's very concerning that public funds are involved here. There should definitely be an investigation into the crying room.
How long do you think this has been going on?
Decades.
So you have decades of silence, you have decades of people that are just working in forced compliance, know it's wrong, but have been intimidated into believing, no doubt, that they can't go anywhere else. And if you think about it, I understand why they would think that, because CBC gets government funding, Global TV gets government funding, CTV gets government funding. All of the major broadcasters get government funding, and broadcasting is a very, very small world in Canada, because it's not like you have thousands of organizations out there that have these news shows. It's designed to be a very, very small number of players in that arena, and we've seen that because we've seen Bill C-11, Bill C-18 that have been lobbied by the big media broadcasters, and they got what they wanted. So I don't actually blame them for thinking that if I speak up, I could lose literally my career, not just my job, but my career, because people know each other in all these different organizations, and I could be blacklisted. Is that fair?
I mean, that's completely, you've hit the nail totally on the head. And I can't blame people for not wanting to speak out, because, I mean, look at Travis, right? Now, Travis is very strong to be out there and he's not backing down. But I mean, he was ripped off the air. They took his show away from him. They put him on leave. Like, people are watching this, right? And, people have families to feed. They've got expenses. They have bills to pay. And when you're in a culture where there is so much toxicity, it really impacts your confidence. So you start feeling like you can't fight back because you feel so weak. And that's part of the conditioning of making people feel like they need to comply or they are unsafe. And it's almost like an abusive relationship, like the CBC not accepting Travis's resignation. It's like, you're not allowed to leave. Even though you want to, we're not going to let you. That's not just a procedural thing or red tape or a weird legal loophole. That's not that at all. That's about one thing. It's about control.
Yeah.
It's only about control.
And one thing that I said to Travis, I said, "Good on you for standing up." I said, "But the hardest part isn't standing up. The hardest part is then refusing to back down, because standing up is one thing, but then facing the blowback and facing the difficulty of what comes at you after you stand up. It's the refusing to back down that is the most difficult part." And I get the sense, and I'm sure you get the sense, that Travis is willing to keep standing and seeing this through. Is that your impression?
Definitely. Look, it's really difficult being the pointy end of the spear. That's what I call my clients. You're out there and it can feel very isolating. Obviously, I have Travis's back, and it really helps that he has a lot of support. So there are a lot of people who come out and they've supported him. But no, he's not going to back down. I will say CBC definitely tried to break him. They did everything they could think of to try and break him, but they didn't succeed. It must be killing them that he's out there and speaking his truth and he's fighting. They hate that. I know they do. They're not used to it. But he's not going to back down. And it's very scary going up against a massive corporation like CBC. They have so much money, but they, as you point out, have so much influence. They have media markets everywhere. They've got so many employees that they have a lot of power. So this really is a David versus Goliath story. But I know that Travis is going to prevail. And, when you hear things like the story I told you about the crying room and the other stories that Travis and I have heard, those are the things that really fuel the fight, because the fight isn't just about one person. It's about so many other people. And I know, like, for Travis and certainly for me, when we hear things like that, that's just more fuel. That's like, okay, have to keep going because so many people have been impacted. And the idea that people's careers or their mental health or their lives are being derailed because of toxic culture at the CBC, that's not acceptable.
Yeah, yeah, especially at an organization that leans toward an ideology that seems to be trying to make people believe that they are for your rights, they are for your opinion, they are for safety at all costs. But as they say, an organization like that believes in your right to have an opinion as long as it aligns with their own. And that seems to be what they're seeing now. In terms of seeing this through, what does accountability look like for Travis? What outcome is he working towards? I imagine part of that would be that he's going to be successful in this legal fight, and I would then hope that one of the outcomes of that is it gives other employees hope that they can actually stand up and fight against the injustice that's going on as well.
It's a good question. I mean, Travis is very aware that many, many people are watching his case. I can't get into the specifics right now about there are specific things that Travis is seeking, and you'll certainly hear more about it once we launch the human rights suit. But I just want to be clear, like, this isn't about money. This is about accountability and really fixing the toxic work culture and the culture that exists of a CBC that makes it so that journalists feel they can't have integrity, and where journalists are punished for having diversity of thought. That Travis wants to fix that. And you would think the CBC would want to fix it too, but I don't think they see that there's a problem there.
Well, to them, they've solved the problem by inventing a room that employees can go and leak their trauma out, and so they don't have to deal with it, and it doesn't have to result in any paperwork for them, obviously. So, but our hope is that the Parliamentary Ethics Committee, at least, or the Heritage Committee, will take a look at this and launch their own independent parliamentary investigation, because there's obviously a lot of problems. I should say a lot more problems at CBC than we were already aware of, and we wish Travis luck and in this fight, and I personally want to thank him for taking it on. It is, as you said, the first people to stand up are the ones that take on the most difficult challenge, because
Yeah.
everyone doesn't believe it's possible until it's possible. So, so we will continue to follow with great interest, and happy to have you on again in the future as more updates become available. Thanks for joining us, Kathryn, and we wish Travis and yourself all the best in this fight to come.